If I were here in person and I could see you, I would ask you how many of you know where Utah is. But since I can't ask you in person, I'm just going to show you where Utah is and talk a little bit about where our university is located. So you can see the map of the United States, and Utah is in red. We're located in the west of the United States, which is why there's such a big time difference between Utah and Belarus. We're located in the very far south of the state. You can see in the other map the little red square. And then behind that we have a picture of our campus. You can see that our campus is surrounded by some very beautiful mountains, and it's a lovely area. Like I said, in the west, in the mountains. So again, I'm very happy to join you today from our lovely campus and talk to you about letters of recommendation. I know that many of you probably participated and listened to Leslie's presentation about letters of recommendation, and I had the opportunity to see that. It was a great presentation. It had lots of really good information. So I do not want to repeat everything that Leslie said, because most of you have already heard it. I will review a little bit of it because, just in case, but then what we'll do is we will cover some information about what universities do with your applications once we receive them. And because your letters of recommendation are within those applications, hopefully this will give you some insight into how your letters of application are read and treated while they're here in the US and decisions are being made about admissions. So what I'm hoping is that if we tell you a little bit about that process, you can understand how to make sure that your letters of recommendation can survive this application process and can make it through to the end and can stand out. So first, what I'd like to do is to review a little bit of information. Some of this was covered by Leslie, but I'll also give you a little bit of my opinion and my perception of what to do with letters of recommendation. I'm going to use the structure of the 5 W's to cover that. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the 5 W's. It's something that we use in the United States quite a bit, especially to talk about sharing information or sharing information in, for example, a newspaper or a very factual form. So the 5 W's are actually 5 words that begin with W plus one that begins with H. I'm not sure why that gets counted as a W, but so they are who, what, when, where, why, and then the H is how. So let's briefly talk about the 5 W's and the H of letters of recommendation, starting out with who should write them. Now that's something that Leslie covered with you, but just to make sure that we are kind of making sure that you understand the importance of this information. Who should write them? Definitely professors or teachers with whom you've worked. If you have had a job and you have employers with whom you've worked and you have a good relationship, those are good people to ask to write your letters of recommendation. Again, we can't stress enough that it is important that you not have family members or friends write your letters of recommendation. That is not going to lead to a strong letter, okay? Now, who reads them? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that because I think you may be surprised at how many people actually read your letters of recommendation. It might be admissions officers, it might be a department chair, it might be a committee of people. And your letters of recommendation oftentimes are read more than once as well. So that's the who of letters of recommendation. And now we'll talk about the what. And what should be included in them is information about you as a student and information about you as a citizen. So again, what we want to gain from reading a letter of recommendation is an understanding of the type of student and citizen that you are. We want to know what your interests are, what type of service you've done for your school or for the city or village or province in which you live. We want to gain an idea of what you as a person will do with the education that you gain here at our university. So that is the what of letters of recommendation. And now I'll go on to the when. When should you ask for them? As far ahead of time as possible. Now, I know that Leslie spoke to you about the fact that some people feel that writing a letter of recommendation takes quite a bit of time and that it is somewhat difficult. So you are more likely to have people willing to write that letter if they do not feel rushed. So do make sure that as soon as you know that you will need a letter of recommendation, that you begin asking your references if they would be willing to write. I'm going to say the same thing about when you should send them in. When you know that you would like to apply to a particular university, definitely begin right away to gather your application materials. It is not a very good idea to wait until the last minute to send in your materials. And when I talk to you a little bit about the process that universities go through when they receive applications, I think that you'll begin to understand why sending in at the last minute or very close to the deadline is not the best idea. So that's the when. Now let's move on to the where. Do make sure that you send your letters of recommendation to the address that is specified by the university. That's just common sense, I know, but it's important to say again because universities receive lots of applications, hundreds or thousands of applications. And because of that, they are not likely to go searching for a letter of recommendation. If a letter of recommendation is missing from an application, universities are going to assume that it was not sent and that the application is incomplete. So do make sure that when you send your application that it is clearly addressed and that it is sent to the address that has been given to you by the university to which you're applying. Now the big question is, why do universities require them? And I covered that a little bit with the what when I talked about we want to see information about you as a student and you as a citizen. Universities require them because we don't oftentimes have the ability to meet every single one of our applicants. Again, remember, we receive many, many, many applications. And because we do not always have the opportunity to have individual meetings with students, we want to see what other people say and believe about these students. We want to see how other people perceive your studies, and your participation in school. So the purpose of a letter of recommendation is to give us a well-rounded perspective on who you are as a student and as a person. There's the why of letters of recommendation. And lastly, let's talk about how. How do you ask someone to write a letter? That can be a little bit difficult and awkward, and we do understand that. You know, as Leslie said, the best thing to do is to ask clearly, to clearly state that you would like, if you would appreciate if the person would be willing to write a letter of recommendation. Give your referee an idea of what that means to write a letter. You know, I am applying to American universities. I wonder if you would be willing to write me a letter of recommendation that discusses who I am as a student and any other observations you have about me. And if you give people specific information such as how long it should be or when it is due, that can also help them make a decision about whether they feel that they have the time or the ability to write that letter. And the last part of the how is, how do universities use them? And that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking to you about, so that you can then understand what happens to your letter after you send it on time and clearly addressed in the mail or via email to the university. So how does a university process applications, and what effect does that have on your letters of recommendation? I'm going to talk a little bit about, I've broken down the process of what universities do with applications into 3 steps. And for each of them, I'll tell you an overall idea of what the university does, and then what that means in terms of your letter of recommendation. So the first thing that happens is, you can see this very messy picture of a giant pile of mail. The first thing that we do is we just have to sort that big pile of mail that we have. As I mentioned before, we oftentimes receive hundreds or thousands of applications, and that can be very overwhelming. So one of the first things that we at the university do is we simply try to organize the applications that we have. And the first way that we do that is simply to see if anything is on time, then that is great. If it's not on time, then it's going to be sorted into a late pile. And it may never be looked at because it was not received on time. And then the next thing that we do to organize and to sort is we make sure that applications are complete. So we look through and make sure that it has the required components, like transcripts, letters of recommendation, test scores, anything else that is required and included on the list. Again, if this is the initial sort, and if applications are late or do not include the required information, they are often just discarded or disqualified. And what this means for your letter of recommendation is, again, what I said before. It's very important to clearly label and accurately address your letters of recommendation so that they are accounted for in your application. Okay, the next step that we go through when viewing applications is what I'm calling a preliminary review. And you can see that what happens with the preliminary review is that we've taken a pile of mail and we've made it somewhat more organized. We now have some organized pieces that we can work with. And generally what happens in a preliminary review is that the pieces are sorted and sent to appropriate offices. So for example, your transcripts are sent to a transcript evaluator. Admissions officers will closely review your application form to make sure that it is completely filled out. Now there are a couple things that may happen to your letters of recommendation in this step. They may first be reviewed by an admissions officer who will check to see if the person who wrote it is a real person. So we do actually check your references. An admissions officer may also review your letter to make sure that it covers the important material and that it's not, for example, a personal letter or something that is mislabeled. So something that is really a personal statement but is labeled as a letter of recommendation. Now at some universities, admissions officers do not read letters of recommendation. They simply separate them from the rest of the application materials and send them to a department or a program representative. So whatever major you're applying to, we may send to that department chair or to a representative or a committee in that department your letters of recommendation for them to review. The important thing to keep in mind when it comes to letters of recommendation and this preliminary review is that you will have many people reading your letter of recommendation. And that means that a lot of people are going to be able to have a view of you as a person, as a student, and as a citizen. So it's a great opportunity when you have a well-written and clear letter of recommendation to give many people at the university you'd like to attend an idea of who you are as a person. Okay, step 3 is probably the most difficult step for the university, and that is we read all of the letters of recommendation that we receive, and we very closely review all of the application materials that we receive. Now remember, I keep reminding you that we get hundreds and thousands of applications, and even when we sort them out, that still means thousands of letters of recommendation that we need to read. And so those may be read by one person or by many people. And they read them and they decide if they're good or if they're maybe middle, okay, or not good. The important thing to keep in mind about this part of the process is that material is reviewed in batches. That means groups, right? So your letters of recommendation will be put into a pile, like you can see in front of this very studious gentleman here, a pile with 20 or 50 or 100 other letters of application, or letters of recommendation. And those are read one after the other, after the other, after the other. So somebody may put aside 1 or 2 hours in a day to simply read letters of recommendation. What this means is that it means two things. One thing is that your letter of recommendation, if it is very similar or if it is copied, it's likely that whoever is reading it will actually notice that. Because again, if they're reading 100 applications and 20 of them are exactly the same, it's going to be very apparent because those 100 applications are being read in the same day or even, right one after the other. The good part of this is if your letter of recommendation is very well done, it will stand out from that big group that it has been put into. So you have the opportunity during this close review that your letter of recommendation will really stand out from the kind of boring, repetitive letters that your reviewers have been reading up until then. And remember, you have no control over where in the pile of letters your letters of recommendation end up. So it's, another thing to think about is that because there isn't going to be that real control over when your letter is read, that it is important for it to be very clear and a kind of a standout letter. Okay, so we do have a final step. These are the three main steps that affect your letter of recommendation. Once all of those parts of reviewing applications have happened, basically applications are sorted. They're reassembled and then they're put into accepted, not accepted, and hopefully, or maybe, some kind of borderline applications. So after everybody has closely reviewed the various application materials and made their recommendations, those materials are put back together, those recommendations are compiled, and that's when people are able to tell if somebody has been accepted or not accepted. What comes into play here is if an application is in the borderline or maybe we're not sure pile, then your materials will be reviewed again. So that's another time and another group of people who may read your letters. And again, perhaps another opportunity for your letter of recommendation to help you stand out in a very large group of applications. Okay, so that was a very general overview of what happens to applications, including your letter of recommendation, when they are received by universities. And again, my hope here is that if you understand how your letter of application travels around, so to speak, in the university after it is received, then you can have an understanding of some of the important elements of a successful letter. And just to make sure, let's review what those elements are. The first thing that's important is that your letter is very clearly labeled so that we can make sure that it's seen as a part of your application. Remember, application pieces are separated out, and we want to make sure that your letter of recommendation always has that association with your application so that it can be put back together with it. We also want to make sure that your letter of recommendation is properly addressed so that it gets to the proper place. Again, remember, when we have a very high volume of applications, it's easy to sort that initial step, that preliminary sort, into complete or incomplete. And if there's a mistake made on the address of your letter of recommendation, it may end up causing your application to be considered incomplete. Another thing that's very important is to make sure that your application and your letter of recommendation as a part of it is submitted on time. If there is a deadline and the sorting occurs at the deadline, then late applications are rejected and they do not get sorted and they do not get reviewed. Do make sure that your letter of recommendation is from a reputable person, from a teacher or from an employer or from a civil servant, somebody that you know, somebody who can speak specifically about you, because many times people do check your references and they look to see if the person who wrote your letter is a real person that we can find. And also you want to make sure that your letter of recommendation is clearly about you and your strengths, because again, many people will read this letter and something which is very vague does not stand out from the hundreds or thousands of letters that people read. So we need to make sure, you want to make sure that you give clear instructions to your referees or suggestions, not instructions, suggestions, of some of the specific characteristics that you have that they could write about. And then also you want to make sure that your letter of recommendation is not something that is copied. Again, when people are reviewing or reading 20 or 50 letters of recommendation, one after the other, it becomes very clear when those letters are copied. And that reflects very poorly on the person whose application that letter is a part of.